So it's my pleasure to welcome back Peter Raven for the second Quain lecture. As you probably know by now, Peter is a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan. And he's perhaps one of the people who has shaped meta-ethics and normative ethics very significantly over the last 40 years. It bears his stamp in many areas, and he has been moving into engaging with really pressing, more applied issues recently, AI and now climate change. So I think we are really thrilled to have Peter here and talk to us about climate change and the 5-second installment.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be introduced, and thank you all for coming. And I won't talk for 90 minutes, but that may only be because somebody stops me. So you've got a warning sign to give me when I...
No, I'm just worried about the screen.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, so this time I'm going to shift emphasis a little bit and talk about the question of ideology and its relation to political feasibility. And last time I claimed that we are in the midst of 3 interrelated crises. We all know the crisis in the sustainability of the current human interaction with the world ecosystem. I claim there's also a crisis in the efficacy and responsiveness of social and political processes in countries that were thought to have well-established democratic regimes. A crisis in well-being, I think, for significant populations, even in the highly developed countries. And that crisis in well-being is going to, I'm afraid, make the first 2 less tractable. I'm going to talk about that some today. I argued that all 3 could be thought of as environmental crises. They're about the kind of climate that human activity can create or might create for something like joint flourishing of humans and other species, or the existence of governing institutions capable of responding effectively and keeping within the domain of human rights, within their borders and across their borders, and also the environment for the widespread enjoyment of lives at a reasonable level of well-being. So think of this as all one big environment, and the question is, what kinds of lives does it make possible? Or what kinds of institutions does it make possible? Or what kind of relationship with the natural world does it make possible? Or even perhaps encourage? And I think these crises are entwined in the sense that when you start following one, you tend to wind up back with the other. They tend to reinforce one another as crises. And I believe that making headway on any one of them is going to require making some headway on the other 2. And this, I'm told, is a critical moment, especially in our relation with the physical and natural environment. But it's a critical moment as well for democracies, and it's a critical moment for well-being. So this is it's a 3-way entwined crisis that is at a critical moment. And the question is, given the current state of things and what we might know or be able to find out about mechanisms or processes, psychological, sociological, political, environmental, is there any way that we could actually make headway likely to happen? Might we be able to learn something about that from trying to understand the nature of happiness itself, the nature, at least, of the part of happiness that is the subjective experience of well-being? And I claim the crises are mutually reinforcing, because if you don't have effective political institutions, there's very little chance that you'll be able to contend with a problem, systematic problem, like the climate crisis. So whatever is necessary to have institutions of that kind is something that we have to solve as a problem. But I think without improving the well-being of key portions of the populations, especially in the developed world, our social and political environment is not going to improve, and it may continue to deteriorate in just the way that would be obstructive to real progress on climate issues. And in the long run, of course, it circles back in the following sense, which is, if we are going to have a decent existence for humans on this planet and for other species that we cohabit with, we are going to have to do something about this climate problem. So there is a long-term way in which they entwine as well. So I claimed last time, I hope with some conviction and maybe with some capacity to convince that we actually have in this vicinity all these inconvenient truths, but one convenient truth at least. And that convenient truth is that there is room within what we know about the sources and nature of human subjective well-being for a mode of existence that is much less heavy in its demands upon the physical and biological world, in which we make up through human relations and human development for many of the things that we now ask material goods to do for ourselves. And that possibility means there actually is space for the well-developed worlds to throttle back their rampant destruction of the environment, for countries that are less well-developed to move to a higher level of subjective well-being without having to bring about the kind of destructive development of material resources we see in the 19th and 20th century. So that's room for these kinds of good solutions to come about. And I think if there wasn't such room, this would be a very intractable problem. So I think it is a convenient truth that there is, I think, at least that much room. So I think the truth's really of crucial importance, but we have to make good use of it somehow. We have to figure out how you would use this truth in some form of political or economic or social practice. And so that's part of what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm claiming to follow the method of synthetic philosophy, which I mentioned last time. And of course, as a synthetic philosopher, I don't do my own experiments. I rely very much on the experiments done by other people. But we can also draw informally on things that you could think of as natural experiments. That is to say, you can come up with a hypothesis in your synthetic philosophical mode, and then say, well, if this were right, then we'd expect certain things when we went out and looked at the data on various kinds of issues in the world. And last time we discussed briefly the question of how different patterns in the development or enrichment of human resources might indeed make it possible to maintain a very high level of subjective well-being in countries with lower, sometimes much lower, GDP per capita than the most prosperous countries. That you don't have to push everybody up to the highest level of prosperity to get very high levels of subjective well-being. And it may even be a mistake to try that because the most prosperous countries may not be doing such a wonderful job. So here's a curve that I showed you last time. This is the cross-national version of the diminishing marginal utility of money, in effect. And what you see here is that if you draw a line across on this index at 3.75 or so, you'll catch a bunch of countries, some in Latin America, some in Northern Europe. And if you look at them, you'll see that there are clusters. There's a cluster down here around 6,000 GDP per capita at the time this survey was taken, and a cluster here at around 25 or something like that. And then there are a couple up here, the very rich countries, which are around 30. And what's interesting is they're all at the same level of subjective well-being. So they're somehow manufacturing a level of subjective well-being, and the population is enjoying that level of subjective well-being. That's what they're reporting as the actual experience of their lives. And they're doing it with much less by way of material demand, or somewhat less by way of material demand. But at any rate, this push does not seem particularly necessary in order to get to that level. And as you look, the countries with the highest levels are not the countries that are the furthest out on the prosperity curve. So what are those countries doing? Well, we saw last time that Latin American countries lead the world in the extent to which the family provides care for the older generation and shares the responsibility for raising the next generation, children of preschool age, for example. And so within the family home, the extended family, they solve some of the most pressing problems of life, which is how do you have a meaningful existence in old age, and how do you look after children in a way that they can grow and flourish. And so they do that without huge material resources because they've got a culture in which family resources do that. And it shows up in the subjective well-being, and it shows up in the stress levels that people report as well. The Scandinavian countries do it very differently. They provide the kinds of services that support child care through social means. They provide care for children through social means. They provide care for the elderly through social means, or support for families that do it. And so they have a much more expensive, but much more elaborate system of support for those kinds of activities. And as a result, they have also among the highest levels of subjective well-being in the world because they're solving those basic life problems. Now, a country like the United States, by contrast, the great majority of the population, even if it had a higher GDP per capita, which most presumably do or don't, they can't really afford to provide that kind of effective care for the elderly or for the young. As a result, people are stressed. Older individuals are stressed because they're isolated and they're in poor facilities. Families are stressed because they can't get care so that they can carry out the jobs that they have to carry out. There's a high level of stress in the school system as a result because of the problems that this generates. And so without spending the money to do it in social means or having the cultural institutions to do it through family means, we leave families in this gap. And as a result, that is a drag on subjective well-being. And that's a big part of your life, especially people who sit in the middle generations, which you all do. So let's just remind ourselves of this table, which was based on a huge survey of the US population. And what we'll see is these are correlations taking as an index a certain level of income. These are correlations of what you get with changes. So if you look at the population that does or doesn't have children, the positive affect level is very similar. The blue affect is indeed more problematic. The stress is much larger on that population, and their life satisfaction is significantly lower. If you look at the population that are caregivers, they're the responsible caregivers, let's say for someone who's elderly or someone who's handicapped, positive affect is seriously affected. Blue affect is much greater. Stress is yet greater still. Life satisfaction is lower. If you look at people with a health condition, we have a health system which you famously know is not very effective for large portions of the population. Positive affect, quite a bit damaged. Blue affect, again augmented. Stress, augmented yet further. Life satisfaction, diminished yet further. Being alone, which is the fate that many elderly people face in our country, that has about the most serious effect on positive affect that we see. It has a substantial effect on blue affect. It increases stress. Living alone is a more stressful condition than living, you think, but if you have to live with your family and you're with your parents and the grandchildren and so on, that's a very stressful environment. You can say, try living alone. And the answer is you'll find it's a more stressful environment and a lower life satisfaction. What about income? What if we just boosted these people's income? Well, what's correlated with that? Well, it does a little bit for positive affect, really not measurable. A little bit to augment negative affect, well, but not a measurable amount. No real measurable effect on stress, but it pushes you up in life satisfaction. But we talked about last time why that would be so. Because the life satisfaction test is a ladder test. You say, put yourself on a ladder where the top rung is the best possible life for you and the bottom rung is the lowest possible life. Where would you place yourself? And when people do that, in a society like ours, where material culture is all important, they put themselves on a rung based on roughly where their income is. And so as a result, there's a high correlation between having more income and being higher on life satisfaction, but that is not really a difference in the quality of people's intrinsic experience. That's a difference in how they perceive their life relative to a scale that is a socially valued scale of merit or value. We should also recognize that it's silly to talk about per capita GDP in this context, because how per capita GDP affects people depends a great deal on how it's distributed. So you could have a society, two societies with the same level of per capita GDP, in one of which it's pushed way up to the upper end of the income domain, as in, let's say, this black line here for the United States, or in others where it's actually fairly widely distributed through the society. And analyses suggest that the reason the Nordic and Scandinavian societies do better on the whole with subjective well-being isn't that the people at the top are spectacularly healthy. If you've been to these countries, you'll know that they aren't spectacularly happy, rather. They're just happy in an ordinary way. But it means that the people in the lower fifth, second, third, fourth group are a little bit higher. In some cases, substantially higher, and that makes for a higher average. So don't think of the average GDP as telling us a tremendous amount about the material well-being of people. Their material well-being is heavily dependent also upon distribution. Okay, well, last time I tried to suggest that the basis for judgments of subjective well-being deserves a close look. Because here I am, I'm citing all this evidence about people's reported subjective well-being, and you might say, well, but we know that self-reports are terrible data, influenced by all kinds of biases and heuristics. People are not very self-insightful. Why would you trust this stuff at all? It's going to be very arbitrary and random, and we looked last time at ways in which it did not seem to behave randomly. It behaved by a normal distribution. And my claim was that it's behaved in this well-defined way because it's rooted in the fundamental affective system of the human. And that fundamental affective system is not just a bunch of emotions that fire off every once in a while in some situation or other. It's actually the way we can keep track continuously, constantly, of how well we're doing. This is an evolutionary perspective on emotions from Nessie and Ellsworth. Emotions are modes of functioning shaped by natural selection that coordinate physiological, cognitive, motivational, behavioral, and subjective responses in patterns that increase the ability to meet the adaptive challenges of situations that have recurred over evolutionary time. Okay, well, think to yourself, I get it, in Scandinavia. Here's a situation that recurs over evolutionary time, or in Latin America. It's how do you care for the elderly? How do you keep them from becoming marginalized? Well, we have certain affective states that keep track of how well we're doing with that, if we're the elderly person or with the family of the elderly person. And those states are doing that registering continuously. We looked at the way in which the subjective construct that you get of positive and negative affect is the result of recruiting information widely from the body and the mind and the context, and using that information to broadcast it widely to the other parts of the mind and the other functions we perform, cognitive, motivational, social, and so on. And so the affective system is the nexus through which that information is being processed. And so if you can find some reasonable way to tap into it, you can find out some very important things about people's lives and how well their lives are going. And this is an analysis of the basic structure of emotion. Notice that crucial is an appraisal. You have events coming in from the outside and concerns. The affective system produces an appraisal of your situation, your possibilities. That appraisal affects your action readiness, how you feel, how aroused you are. Those all affect behavior. And then there's a regulation process that, based upon the outcome, for example, of behavior, affects what that appraisal is going to be. And so this is a mechanism not only for appraising and regulating, it's a system also for learning. So appraisal and orientation are the fundamental features you should look for in an effective system. They're crucial because that's what they do. Fear, anger, resentment, amusement, surprise, each one of those you can think, okay, there are features of a situation which are appropriate for fear if you can be well attuned to them. Because fear, what does it do? It increases your arousal, your action readiness, it heightens your cognition with regard to certain things, it dampens your cognition with respect to others, it slows your digestion so that you've got more energy for whatever it is that you have to do. And so fear is a whole suite of responses to the perception of risk in a situation, one aspect of which is the feeling of fear. But the idea is the feeling of fear is a registration of that organized response to the situation, the evidence of the situation. Similarly with resentment, which is a popular political mood right now. We're going to talk more about that later. They appraise a situation, they appraise your needs relative to it, the likelihood that you're going to be able to manage the situation or not. And the design of the brain is such that this information, again, plays a very wide role in your behavior and your thought. And so when we ask about people's subjective well-being in these polls, what do? Well, we say, how many times in the last 2 days or something like that have you felt the following emotions? And they give you a list, and you pick on a scale how much you did or how intensively you did and so on. And so they're getting a little thermometer of your affective states, positive and negative. And what are those states? They might be sadness, stress, anger, enjoyment, satisfaction, and worry. And you say, okay, what aspects of people's lives are those tracking if they're well calibrated? What are they keeping in touch with when they feel sadness? Well, in touch with loss, let's say. Stress, in touch with the need for heightened vigilance and activity in order to manage a situation. Anger, a situation that is in some sense causing you difficulties, but in a way that are social and therefore motivate a kind of response that directs you to engage socially, to change. These are affective states then that are responding to features of our lives. And they would have, I suspect, if we were to look at them, you would say these are things which, and it's interesting that this seems to be true. If you ask people about these, they will report to you how things are going with these emotions. They've got answers to these questions. Okay, well, there's the thought. These kinds of states provide summative evaluations of how well things are going and meeting our needs and reaching our goals. Are we doing better or worse? In humans and animals, that sensitivity is located in the affect and reward system, which is also the seat of learning and important kind of action guidance. And this is not a quirk. It's not like a funny feature of evolution that we were designed this way. This kind of reward-based learning you find throughout the animal world, even in animals that don't have any conscious existence at all. They have an effective system that works like this. In normative decision theory, you find the same kind of a basis where you've got values and expectations, and those values and expectations are put together in a sum which computes the different values of the different actions that are available to you. You learn from your actions whether you should adjust those values. That's normative decision theory. And if you look at the design of artificial intelligence agents, they're based on this kind of reward-based learning. The new generation of artificial intelligence agents, the one who are solving the problems of playing chess much better than humans, they do reward-based learning. And they do evaluation, and the evaluation regulates the way in which they adjust and change their behavior. And as a result, they can do things that we never expected them to do because they're not running a program telling them what to do. They are sensing the possible gains or losses in their environment, representing them, using that information to act, and then updating that representation based upon the outcome. So they can learn things that we couldn't learn and that we had never taught them. Okay, now if that hypothesis is right, or at least nearly right, then I'm saying we have good reason for taking the judgments of subjective well-being as important information. And therefore thinking that if we learn something from looking at these patterns, that's something we should take seriously. Even if as philosophers we think, look, this is superficial, or it's certain type of psychology, we say, well, it's just self-report data. My claim is it's actually got a tremendous amount of information value. And part of the way I tried to convince you of that is to show you the effective system at work. And this was the effective system of macaques, and we saw that it was calibrating to the probability and magnitude of the rewards. It was computing these via neural spikes. It was calibrating also and computing the risk involved in the situation. It does this in numerical form, so to speak, and it computes the way decision theory tells it to. That you take the probability of an outcome, the value of the outcome, and compute an expected value, but you're also mindful of the dimension of risk. And so in normative decision theory, this is what you would have to compute if you were a perfectly rational animal. And this is what animals compute continuously. As a result, they face a cognitive map of the world, which is not just a geographic map, but it's a map of expected value, of different possible actions and outcomes, and it navigates using that. So think of this not just as a representation, but like as your cell phone. You're staring at this thing, and it's telling you which road to take as well. And this one would take 15 minutes, and that would take 10 minutes, and this one's got traffic, and this one's more scenic, whatever it is. So it's doing the kind of thing that you ask your cell phone directional programs to do for you. And I think this excites in many people's mind the idea, ridiculous. Rats aren't rational utility maximizers like this. And they're not utility maximizers because they take into account risk, which is sensible for a living organism. But do rats really do this? And so here's how I try to convince you of that. This is the way rats represent physical space. This is measurements in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex of rats as they explore a box randomly. And that black line is the movement of the rat. And what you'll see is there are two kinds of mapping going on. There are certain neurons which fire when the rat is at a certain point in the box. And there are other ones that fire in a regular pattern, a grid-like pattern, connected by 60-degree angles. And this means that the rat can represent both its local environment, what's around it, and also where that is relative to a grid. Okay? Once again, it's what you would want to have in a spatial navigation system. Now, take a maze. So this is a maze that a rat's going to be trained on. It's a T-maze. You start it here. It can go up the center channel. You have some false leads here to get it to give it something to work with in the early learning, and then decide not to bother with. But the key thing is when it gets to that choice point, which way does it turn? And you can reward it on either side, left or right. And depending upon the rate at which you reward on either side and the magnitude of the rewards, you can get it to turn left or right with a certain frequency. That's basic reward-based learning. And then it gets to go back down and run the trial again. So that's what the maze looks like. This is what it looks like if you look at the neurons that we were describing and you map them onto the location of the rat. And what the rat does is construct a neural map like this of the maze. Now, how do we know it's a neural map and not just a bunch of accidental correlations? Well, let's take a look at what happens when the rat is resting or sleeping. And when the rat is in sleep, in certain stages of sleep, what we'll see is that that pattern gets continuously activated over and over again. It's replayed. And it's not just replayed in exactly the way it was done. It's replayed in moving in other directions of motion. The greatest activity is in the areas of the maze that were least visited. That's how a learner would explore space. What you know the least about is what you should explore most. So in their sleep, they're exploring the maze. And the next morning, their performance is better. So this is how you solve philosophical problems in your sleep. Right? You've wondered how you do that. You run the maze. That's what philosophical problems are. Many times you focus on the things that you weren't thinking about during the day because you were hyper-focused on one thing rather than another. And as a result, connections that you didn't know about or weren't aware of or hadn't thought through are there in the morning waiting for you. Just have to remember to write them down. And this is a nice example because it shows that when they do this, they don't just do the paths that they've run, but they start constructing shortcuts. Because they can represent space in a non-egocentric way, they can say, I know that this box isn't just up the channel left and left. That box is this relation to the channel. So if I could get through there, I could get to the box more quickly. And one of the first discoveries of this phenomenon was by Lashley, the great experimental psychologist, who noticed that a rat that he had placed in the start box, but he hadn't fully closed it so the rat could escape. What the rat did was not run up the center channel and turn right again to get to the food. It went directly right over to the food. It knew that the food was on the diagonal, and that's because it's creative in its utilization of information, and it is creative through this kind of mental simulation, and the simulation incorporates the values and the geometry of space. Okay, so now let's look at a rat sitting at the choice point. The rat has gone up the center channel of the maze. It's sitting at that choice point. And these are little slices at 60 milliseconds of recordings. And what you'll see is that the activity, the recording, sweeps first down the right arm of the maze, then it comes back and sweeps down the left arm of the maze. And the intensity of that firing is proportional to the expected value of those two arms based on its past experience. And it does this a couple times fast like that. And eventually, it discovers that, of course, there's more expected value on the right-hand side, and it will take the right hand of the maze. So it's sitting there at the choice point, imaginatively simulating what's down these two possible arms of the maze, taking the values that it's learned for those, comparing them, and using that as a basis for choice. Okay, so that's the effective system that you've got underneath the many layers of your higher order thought that I have to confuse myself. Underneath, I'm able to navigate the world effectively because, fortunately, evolution endowed me with this kind of a system. Okay, well, what if we get a little fancier and we start giving more complicated rewards and different kinds of risks? What do we discover? Can we actually map a utility function? And this is macaques again, and sure enough, we can. By varying the gambles, we can get them to build a standard-looking utility function. They're risk-seeking for low value. They're risk-avoiding for high value. And if you want to know what their expectations look like, you can find them by discovering this underlying curve. So as Glimcher, the neuroeconomist, likes to say, it's not as if we were calculating utilities or as if we had a utility function. We have utilities, and we use them just the way that you would hope we could. Here's measurements taken in the human brain in similar regions. You'll see that there are some neurons that record expected value that vary linearly between 0 and probability 1. And there are others that are maximal at 0.5, which is the point of maximum risk. So we're doing these computations too. The computations are done in regions that overlap with each other, and so we're able to come up with something like expected utility values. Okay, so that suggests that these affective systems are generating quite interesting, reliable, well-calibrated information about how our situation is going, better or worse compared to what we would have expected, or what our needs are, or what our conditions are, what our resources are. Okay. Humans, of course, we have the ability to take this system and project it and leverage it a great deal. So we can imagine scenarios that aren't just in the next moment or down the next arm of the maze, but we can imagine scenarios that are a month or a year or 50 years out. We've developed language, artificial symbol systems. We can extend projection to very long periods. We've got calendars. We can coordinate on these things. We can exchange information verbally and benefit from others' experiences. And so what we can do is we can take this basic prospection system, leverage it by the distinctively human cultural capacities of language and symbolic manipulation and so on. And as a result, we can, by our design, manage to look at a problem like long-term climate change. In other words, we are built in such a way that we can investigate a problem like long-term climate change. It's not going against our grain for us to think this way. This is, in fact, the way humans evolved. And these kinds of institutions and practices and so on, they evolved fairly rapidly once Homo sapiens came on the scene. Okay, so that was all just by way of trying to set aside worries that the affect system is no reliable place at all to look for good information about how things are going in people's lives. Now let's talk about some of the patterns that we find and some of the interesting questions they might raise about well-being. Okay, well, here's the pattern that stumped people it stumps people still. It's even got a name, the Easterlin paradox, named after a famous economist who first made a careful observation of it. And what you'll see is that the US GDP, US disposable income per capita, rose steadily between 1946 and 1989 with some blips here and there. But subjective well-being as recorded, or as reported by individuals, didn't substantially change. And so the thought was, well, look, if we're getting all of this activity from people wanting to be happier, and if they're not getting any happier as a result, what explains the activity, or what's going on, and what does that tell us about the kinds of things that might be sources of happiness? And we saw that there's a similar thing. If this is looking at the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands between 1973 and 2004. You can see that they're relatively flat, but you can see by looking at their curves for disposable income per capita that they were growing extremely rapidly during that period, just as we were. So again, it's not a phenomenon just of one country. It's a phenomenon that's quite generalized. So here's got to be part of the answer. That's an aggregate result for populations. Suppose we take a look at individuals once again. If what we see is that the factors of freedom from stress, absence of blue affect, and positive affect, if those plateau at a certain income, then adding income to this system is not going to produce more positive affect or less negative affect. It will change ladder values only for the individuals who put themselves at the top of the ladder. But there will always be people who put themselves at the bottom of the ladder too. And so here's what becomes of the explanation. Positive and negative affect, stress and so on, they hit a plateau at a reasonable level of material well-being. Life's other problems can't typically be solved by just more money, so money has diminishing marginal utility. There are small fluctuations in economic conditions, and we looked at those last time, but those have effect on positive or negative affect, which tends to cancel out over time or across lives. And so that means affect, at least if the income in the society is, median income is at about the level of sufficiency, which it is in the European societies, then you're not going to expect affect to change by pushing up the level, the absolute level of income. Life satisfaction, well, what about that? Doesn't that climb with income? Or climb with the log of income, as people now like to say? Yes, it does, but the ladder is just moving up. So there will still be people at the bottom and still be people at the top, and some people who report lower life satisfaction and other people who report higher. And the absolute, whether this ladder is standing on the ground or on the first story or the second story or the third story, those values are going to be the same too. Unless something very dramatically different happens in the society, the ladder values are going to be the same because people are giving a relative assessment, not an absolute assessment. And the society will have a hierarchy of incomes. And so, of course, if that's what we're measuring, then we should expect that we're going to get this kind of flatness. At least in countries where the income, the median income, is at a reasonable level of sufficiency. And where we don't see this is where we see countries where the median income is well below sufficiency. And we saw that when we looked at countries that had relatively low income and relatively low subjective well-being, and also countries that go through catastrophic changes in their social or economic system. And so it's not a law of nature that this is going to be a flat curve. It's dependent upon the particular circumstances of the post-war world, that those measures weren't going to change. And if you were in a society where something happened that dramatically changed the economy or the political and social system, then you would get quite significant fluctuations. So it's not that nothing happens, it's that what happens is a function of what's going on. Okay, well, here's some other part of the puzzle. This is early work that was done. People play the lottery. People sometimes win a lot in the lottery. Suppose we look at people who have won a lot in the lottery, and we look to see if that improves their subjective well-being. And the answer is, at the time, it does. So here we've got an average that's somewhere around 3.6 or something like that in the population, and lottery winners are up at 4. They're not at 5, but they're up at 4. The control group's at 3.82. Severe accident victims, these are people who suffer the severe loss of mobility in an accident. At the time of the accident, they go down to 3. Okay, suppose we look at these same individuals 18 months later. Where are the control group? Where the control group was, 3.82. Didn't I tell you that? The lottery winners are at a lower level than the control group. The severe accident victims have come up remarkably. And this is a measure of their mundane pleasures in life. So this is how well their life is going day to day, day to day. And if you've won a lot of money, you've had a big excitement, and it didn't change your life and make everything work very well for you, so your mundane pleasures are actually somewhat lower. Severe accident victims learn to adapt, and they find pleasure in adaptation, and as a result, their subjective well-being can rise. We are adaptive creatures. But this is not because we don't have any interesting correlation between our subjective well-being and the life conditions. It's that these actually are correlated with changes in their life conditions in the way described. And last time we looked at these event curves for marriage. People's subjective well-being goes up in anticipation. It stays high for a little while, and then it goes back to roughly where it was before. Birth of a child, it goes down, as you might expect, and then comes back up. So those kinds of life events, which are normal parts of a life one often hopes for, those don't have a net effect of pushing you into another category with respect to happiness. What about unemployment? We saw last time that unemployment does push one down. It pushes one further down the longer one's been unemployed. And the explanation for that was that this is still an anomalous condition that you're in. And so your body's affective system can't be telling you, oh, bounce back from this, everything's fine, just keep doing what you're doing. Because what you're doing is not getting you employed. You're using up your savings. You're getting more and more out of touch and untrained. And so you need to be more and more vigilant as the unemployment deepens. So as a result, your stress levels continue to go up, your worry continues to go up, your enjoyment goes down, and they are, again, not just returning to some set point or something like that, they are responding. And what we call this kind of response, these kinds of responses, is not habituation. It's not that people habituate to a given level of existence, because then being unemployed for a long time, well, that would make no difference. They accommodate the way that your blood hemoglobin accommodates to high altitude, the way that your blood cortisol levels accommodate to being in a situation that requires, that involves stress. You undergo a change in your physiology, in your life, in your relations, and that change then shows up in other kinds of measures, like, for example, physiological measures. And here's a very nice example of that. This is an experiment Kent Berridge and a student did. We're looking at the nucleus accumbens shell of a rat. And this rat is being exposed to frightening conditions. And here's where it is when it's in its normal state. And you can see there's only a small part of this region that's devoted to things like defensiveness. Here is when you've put it in a state where things are starting to change and it's begun to have to represent different possibilities, plus or minus. And here's what happens when it's in a stressful state. So more and more of the shell gets devoted to the stressful state. That's an accommodation to the level of stress. It will go away when the stress level goes back down, but as long as the animal's in the stressful situation, it needs to accommodate in that way because there are more distinctions between levels of stress or levels of fear, levels of opportunity, that it has to pay attention to that make this, so to speak, a magnifying glass that you've got to put on the opportunities in that situation. So that's accommodation, and that's what people do. You get, therefore, stable differences in level. In, for example, Switzerland, in this elaborate study, as we looked last time, you'll see that being a foreigner gives you a lower score, characteristically, chronically, than being Swiss, and being unemployed gives you one of the very lowest scores. Okay, so that's accommodation. We accommodate via changed levels. The point here is, don't think that these flat curves of subjective well-being mean it's not informative. It means it's informing you about some very specific kinds of circumstances, and different kinds of circumstances do not produce anything like that. They produce the kind of response that you would expect. Okay, so I've talked about a crisis in subjective well-being, and I haven't said much about what that crisis is or what it looks like. And today we're going to look at two versions of that crisis. They're both subpopulations within prosperous countries. They work in somewhat different ways, but they both show up as a chronic decline in subjective well-being because the life conditions of these individuals are changing. And so the first one, generally speaking, subjective well-being for some reason has stopped being so flat. It's going down in the United States, and it's going down in a generalized way. This is the percentage of people who report themselves as not too happy, which is below happy. You can see it's been going up. It's been going up for some time now, since about a little before 2000, it started to go up. And here's what the world looks like. This is negative affect. As you can see, it's been climbing. The life satisfaction has been declining, and the positive affect has not been increasing. And so as a result, the world measures as less happy now than it was in 2006. So what's happening? Why are we getting these downward trends now? Why is it not stable as it once was? And you may remember the curves for looking at subjective well-being in the aging population in the United States versus the former Soviet bloc. In the places like the United States, Australia, and so on, old age is actually a fairly happy time up until the last few months. But in the countries where the support system has disappeared, you can see, this is the wrong part of the slide. Pay no attention. Okay. It looks like that, but it's a different part of the slide. Recently, let's look at teenagers. That's the population I wanted to look at anyhow. And this blue line is the happiness level that's reported by teenagers. And as you can see, here's 2006, here's 2017, and it has undergone a substantial decrease. So let's ask about what time they have spent in various activities. And so this line is the amount of time they spent working with the internet. This line is the amount of time they've spent sleeping. And this is the line for in-person social interaction. Okay. Now that's a fundamental change in their life conditions. And as a result, we could expect it to have some effect on their happiness, up or down. And the answer seems to be markedly down. So this is a crisis. And in fact, if you do educational psychology, or if you're worried about the condition of our young people, you'll realize we are actually in a mental health crisis for young people right now. Quite severe. What's going on? Well, are people just engaging in these activities because they're enjoyable? So here is a measure of how much people find a given activity enjoyable, up or down. Here are the phone activities. The purple ones are non-phone activities. So here are things that people experience as positive. Sports, exercise, interpersonal interaction, volunteer work, going to the movies, religious services, TV news even. Those are experienced as positive. These are experienced as increasingly negative. Internet news, talking on the cell, video chat, surfing the web, and so on. And the interesting thing is these are activities that are less enjoyed even while you are in the activity. This is experience-based sampling. These are the activities that people are spending more time doing. These are the ones they're spending less time doing. So the question to ask yourself is, why are people spending more time doing activities that they enjoy less? And that's going to be the first part of our answer to the question of where the crisis in subjective well-being comes from. Okay, so here's what the overall trend looks like for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And as you can see, from about 2006 onward, it's uniform. It's not just the youngest ones, it's not the oldest ones, it's a very uniform trend. And here's what it looks like for college students. These are measures of relationship. This is a level of depression. You can see it's been going up. And this is anxiety. And anxiety in particular has been going up for college students. Okay. So the next group we're going to look at a little bit later on, is a very different subpopulation. It's the white, middle-aged, non-college graduates in the United States. They're also having a crisis of subjective well-being. But for now, the question is, what do we learn from looking at this phenomenon? Why would people, intelligent people, I tried to convince you that they had these wonderful affect systems, and now what are they doing? They're engaged in activities that are not producing greater happiness for them, and they're spending more and more time in the activities that are less and less enjoyable, and their lives as a result are going downhill. So what is the problem? And the problem is that there is a glitch in the way in which our utility function operates. And it's not a glitch that you could remedy, but it is a glitch like this. Okay. I'm skipping here, as you can tell. All right. Actually, I'll come back to some of these things later. This is what I'm calling the front-end effect. Many of the activities from which we derive greatest subjective well-being actually require significant initial effort. They're hard to do. Volunteering activities, it's hard to set those up, it's hard to get involved with them. They're very intensive in terms of planning and engagement. Sports activities, activities that involve organizing groups and so on, they require a very substantial initial investment. Activities like watching television, surfing the web, checking your email, those don't require any initial investment of effort. And from the standpoint of someone who's mildly bored or whatever, they appeal as attractive because they're a source of novelty. And so just keeping your head down and looking at the blips and the dips of your affective system at the very moment when you might pick up your phone and look at it, or instead pick up your calendar and try to figure out how to plan an outing to the river with a bunch of your friends, if you're standing there and looking at that moment, then the guidance system that you've got is telling you it's easier to go toward the television than to go in the other direction. And as a result, people tend to do that. This is a front-end effect. It's a kind of user illusion that we have. And what it means is that the kinds of activities that place more demands on us tend to get shortchanged. And the ones that place fewer demands tend to get more time of ours. And the insidious thing is that they're now designed in a way to try to capture and hold attention. And so it's not just that you get into them easily, it's that you don't get out of them easily. And so as a result, we've got large industries that have based their economic model on the fact that people have an easy entry into this and a difficult exit. And as a result, they've succeeded in trapping a large number of people. And as a result, we have a lowered subjective well-being for these individuals. This is what happened with television when it got introduced. These are the number of hours that people spent in a family watching television over this long period from 1950 to 2016. Now, people have stopped watching as much television. That's more work than picking up your phone, apparently. Or it's less entertaining or less intriguing. As a result, people are not watching as much television. If you do experience sampling and you page people when they're in the middle of an activity and they tell you what activity it was, are they surfing the web, are they watching television, are they out on an outing with their friends, and you say, what's your momentary sense of how well your life is going? If you look at that data, what you find is watching television is mildly boring, surfing the web is annoying, being out on an activity with your friends is fun, and you're there surfing the web. Okay, so that's a trap. It's a trap we have to be mindful of. But it's not just a trap with regard to teenagers and cell phones. It's a trap with regard to consumption. In general, it's easier to go out and consume some item than to develop the skill that would replace that item, or develop the relationship that would replace that item. I can think, God, you know, our neighborhood could get together and buy a snowblower, and then we could all share the snowblower, and then, you know, make sure it was... or I could just get down to the hardware store and buy a snowblower. And by the way, they're on sale. It's very cheap. And so we all go and we buy our own snowblowers. And so all over the suburbs, there are these garages full of equipment that is not being used, except very sporadically. If we were sharing these things, the evidence is if we had shared resources like this, we'd actually would find that a more enjoyable situation. Because we'd interact more, we'd get to see people more, we'd have more conversations. But it's much, much easier to solve that problem by consumption. And fortunately, we've got an international system producing consumer goods keyed to the production of at the cheapest possible level. And so many people can afford to get caught in exactly this very same trap. And so the advertisers and the producers rely upon this feature of your effective system. But it's not a feature of the effective system that you have to be prisoner to. It's just one that is very hard to resist. And that's sensible enough. So that's one explanation of why we are having a decline in subjective well-being. Because interesting as it was to go down to the mall and buy a snowblower, that only took a little while. And then the rest of the time you're just cursing yourself for having this thing taking up space in your garage. But the internet, the cell phone, and so on, those have been extremely effective, much more effective. And as a result, sociability has gone down, interactions have gone down, and subjective well-being has gone down. Okay? Back to where we were. Okay, so the interesting thing about asking this question about our reward function is that the human reward function is something that you can interrogate in various ways. You could interrogate it by asking people to make a preference, like for a purchase in the market. And if you do that, what you'll find is that people are drawn to these low-entry solutions to the problem from which they get relatively little pleasure. Okay, so that's one way to interrogate it, and the economists call that a preference. And so if you're asking as an economist, do people show a preference for these activities as opposed to environmental activism? The answer is yes, they show a strong preference for these activities over environmental activism. And the story about that is this is telling us what it is that they really want, what it is that would be good for them. And we're the best judge of that, so we'll follow it. But another way to interrogate is to go around asking people, how is your life going? Ask them at the moment, ask them in retrospect, ask them in different contexts. And when you interrogate in that manner, you're getting a different kind of answer. What happens if you look at the kind of utility function that people have by asking those questions about subjective well-being? And so one of the first things you notice is that our reward function is not just egocentric. If you look at the kind of mapping that intelligent animals do and the kind of mapping that humans do, we are very sensitive to the environment around us. And as a result, the way in which we map the value of the environment and the way that affects our own sense of well-being, that has a characteristic that it is not just your own state. And so, for example, just as you represent space in a non-egocentric way, you represent the world around you in non-egocentric ways. So preschoolers, for example, they spontaneously extract information from watching third-party interactions about others' values and the norms that are prevalent in the community. Even in the first year of life, they show a preference for puppets that help as opposed to puppets that hinder, but not them, not helping them, help other puppets. But they have a preference, nonetheless, for the helper over the hinderer puppet. They're not simple conformists. They learn the norms of their community. They can extract them. You don't have to sit them down and explain all of these things to them. That's how you learn language. But by age 3 to 4, for example, they will refuse to follow commands of authorities if the command is for doing something harmful. So if the teacher says to you, the substitute teacher says, I'm the substitute teacher, and in my classroom you have to raise your hand before you speak, then kids will try to raise their hand before they speak. If you say, I'm the substitute teacher, and you want to speak, what you have to do is jab your pencil into the arm of the person next to you, they won't do this. Well, why not? They know about norms, conventions, so on, because they're representing that as a harmful action, and they will correct that, and they will correct unfair distributions. They will do that at expense to themselves. If you get them to do a joint project and you give all the jelly beans to one, most infants, even at age 3, will partition the jelly beans out more fairly with the others in the group. And so infants early on are showing a preference for pro-social activities on the part of others, being in an environment where there are pro-social activities, and correcting or controlling for various kinds of harm in their environment. Notice that the motivation for all this is intrinsic and non-instrumental because there's no external sanction or reward being given for this activity. In these experiments, for example, they're not given any reward at all. They're doing this spontaneously. What if we look at adults? Well, we've looked at some examples. What does income tell us about their reward function? Well, you can, up to a certain point, improve it with income, but after a certain point, you don't see that much improvement. Unemployment has a dreadful effect. Isolation, ill health, poor responsiveness of government. Things that are correlated reliably with higher subjective well-being are social connectedness, social capital, feeling that you belong to society, social affiliation, generosity, community involvement, participation in meaningful or shared activities. Among adults, these are also experienced as more positive. Physical activity, the development of skills, contact and engagement with nature, communicating with others expressively, secure, challenging employment that you see as in some way contributory and have some degree of autonomy in, freedom from physical insecurity and illness, having higher levels of trust in others, living in a community with higher levels of trust. This is a factor that has a high correlation with subjective well-being. These things are experienced independent of other incentives, rewards, or demands. And so they have a kind of internal structure to them such that if we look at these, we could say, that's the reward function of these humans. We're looking at their reward function. And the question is, if we have a reward function like that, is it possible for us to be engaged on behalf of something like environmental change or environmental activism or contending with the environmental problems we face? And the answer seems to be it is the kind of reward function that would be engaged by that kind of activity if we can provide a context in which that activity can be effective and be enjoyed widely. And of course, this is something Aristotle would have told us. He says you can understand the nature of someone's motivations and their character by looking to see what makes them happy. By looking to see what makes people happy, we discover a fair amount about what kind of general character, what's typical of the human reward function. And families, economic systems, institutions, societies, cultures can evolve in ways that are more or less supportive of that kind of development, and as a result, more or less supportive of well-being. And so communities, families that do a better job of this experience higher subjective well-being. Other kinds of communities are set up in such a way that people are in a more instrumental or competitive or commercial relation with one another. And as we might expect as a result, that part of the reward function is not being encouraged. Another part of the reward function is, and it's a part that is not experienced as subjectively as rewarding. And so here's that idea that we are creating climates for well-being, and the climate that we create is going to reflect the conditions for flourishing in that country. Here's another contemporary theory of well-being. It's Seligman's PERMA theory. What are the big components of subjective well-being on this theory? Obviously, the experience of positive emotions, but also engagement in projects and with others, having positive relationships with others, finding your activity a meaningful activity, and doing something that you can count as an accomplishment. Here is Csikszentmihalyi's account of optimal experience. Optimal experience isn't the passive enjoyment of the most splendiferous meal that you've ever seen. It tends to be cooking rather than consuming food that's enjoyable. These tasks have to be challenging, not entirely beyond our capacities. They have to call for full development of thought and skill. They have to be congruent with our values. They need to reflect our goals and give us feedback. The individual feels some measure of control or mastery in the activity. So these are activities which, if you sample them, people report the highest levels of well-being. Psychologically, the individual is immersed in the activity or engaged intensively with others. The individual tends to forget the self in these intensive, highly enjoyable activities, and the experience is focused on a goal beyond the self. And so this is another way of tapping into the question of what does our reward function look like. And optimal condition for our reward function seems to be this kind of activity. So again, is this the kind of activity that is going to be an obstacle to mobilizing people on behalf of some kind of important environmental change? And the suggestion is no, actually what's against the grain is not that kind of activity, but what is against the grain is a culture that turns people from that kind of activity into something like consumption, focuses them away from self-development and focuses them instead on a relative advancement. And those who have a value for materialism, those who have a distinctively materialistic value scheme, they have lower subjective well-being in general, and they get less pleasure even from consumption. So we aren't built, this is not what we are built for. We are built for something rather different. And these elements, they're not resource intensive, they're not expensive, they're not restricted to a small portion of the population. And outside the scope of social support, they're not outside the scope of social support. Okay. So, let's now talk about our current political situation. If you're curious about that, this is another front-end effect. Manufacturers have learned that people respond very positively to the initial taste of an item. And so manufacturers in the United States have figured out ways to load fat and sweetness into things that produces a stronger initial hit, even though you're less happy with how you feel afterwards. And so this is just a comparison of products between the USA, which has tuned up this system very nicely, and UK. You're still lagging behind in your technology of the manipulation of preferences, and you probably benefit from it. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happened to another population. Time?
It's 25 past 7.
Mm-hmm.
So we're about 60 minutes in.
60?
Yeah.
About 60 minutes in. Okay, I'll try to be very quick with this then. During that great post-war boom, which we were looking at, a substantial fraction of the increase in gross domestic product was going to the group of individuals who had middle incomes. It was widely shared. Starting in the 1980s with the reform of the tax system, the elimination of certain types of antitrust activities, the removal of certain kinds of protections from unionization, outsourcing of production, and so on, a dramatic change occurred in which the bulk of the growth went to the very most prosperous individuals. And so that great post-war boom which spread a kind of material sufficiency widely, had transformed in that period into one that was concentrating this wealth in a very tight way. Here is the labor share of GDP. Here you see it in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and here you see what's happened since then. And here you see the pre-tax national income share of the bottom 50% versus the top 1%. And as you can see, the bottom 50% has systematically declined, while the top 1% has systematically increased. And so the question is, what do changes like this, which are changes in material conditions, very substantial ones, what kind of effect can we expect them to have on subjective well-being? Could we expect subjective well-being to have no response in result of this change? And so we're going to look at a particular population that's been very heavily affected by this. So here is the view of the American population on income mobility. This was a very important part of the ideology of the post-war boom, that people could gain by working hard. And if you compare the United States to other countries, this is a range for other countries, you would see that people in the United States very strongly felt people get rewarded for their effort, very strongly felt people get rewarded for intelligence and skills. It's the responsibility of government to reduce differences in income, very low score. So that's how things stood in the year 2001. But if you at the same time looked at other countries, you'd realize actually the United States was in the bottom group for income and social mobility. We were a less mobile society than the old world societies of Northern Europe. The chance that the son's earnings were going to be determined by the father's earnings were just about as high in the US as they were in the United Kingdom. And the percentage of people earning more than their parents had shrunk down from 1940 down to 1980. And so this was a society which had an ideology of expecting mobility, not just income, but mobility. And as a result, immobility became a special kind of problem for this population because it was denying a certain fundamental expectation of the society. And apparently similar downward mobility figures can be given for England. Now you might say, with an ideology like middle-class ideology, you would say, that's okay. I know that I am not earning as much as my parents did, or that my job is not as secure, or that I don't have the kind of pension and protections they did. But that's my fault. That's my individual failing. And the thing is, suppose that you can't believe that because your geographic and social reference points are systematically being influenced in the same way. And that's what this kind of redistribution of income does. It changes the reference points for people's experience. And so here's where we look at intergenerational mobility in the United States. And here we see in dark red the areas with the lowest chance of escaping from the bottom fifth of the population. Here is the correlation between inequality and intergenerational mobility. As you can see, lower inequality gives you higher intergenerational mobility. Greater inequality gives you less. So making the society less equal makes for less mobility. Our society became, the United States and Europe, became conspicuously less equal. Did people's perceptions change? Well, suppose you ask people, do you think that people today have lots of opportunity or not much opportunity? In 1952, people in the United States, 87% said there's lots of opportunity. By 1997, that was 81%, still very high. Now it's about 50% and falling. And so people perceive in their environment, not just in their own lives, they see in their environment that it is not offering them the deal that was supposed to be offered by middle-class ideology, namely, you work hard, you will be rewarded, you'll be able to take care of your children. What if you ask people now why someone is rich or why someone is poor? Now, the answer, worked harder for richness, is only 45%. 43%, almost half, think it was having advantages. Why a person is poor, lack of effort, only 34% now. 53% circumstances beyond their control. So this is moving away from the middle class idea that your fate is determined by your effort. And by 2015, only 28% of middle class households, as defined by income in the US, reported that they could live comfortably. 69% reported that they had little or nothing left over after meeting basic necessities. That's 69% of middle-class households. That's a remarkably precarious condition for the supposedly solid middle class. 39% said they worried every day or almost every day about paying their bills. 37% reported these feelings of stress frequently. And so the other crisis for subjective well-being, and we'll talk more about this next time, is that that social group that had been the solid middle class, that was the backbone of the country and the core of the prosperity, that group has fallen dramatically in its relative share of income. And as a result, it's now not able to sustain the elements of the middle class ideology, to live comfortably, to live without stress, to look after your children, promote their well-being. And so as a result, we are seeing now a secular decline in subjective well-being in these countries. And unfortunately, the political consequences of that have been, for the standpoint of the environment or mobilizing for change in the environment, they have been quite dramatic and negative. If we're going to reverse that trend, we will probably have to do something about this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we have a bit under now, I think, for questions. Kevin, over to start.
Peter, there are different parts of human psychology you discussed.
Yeah.
Some parts that are responsible for subjective well-being seem to be very finely engineered to ensure that we are calibrating our psychology well to how well we're doing. Whereas some other parts are not so finely calibrated, finely engineered, such as the part that's responsible for things like front-end effect.
Yeah.
Right? Is there any evolutionary explanation for the latter part of our psychology?
Yeah.
So that's one question, if I could ask one more. In classic political philosophy, in the state of nature, people have motivations to join in confederation, because unless they join, they will be attacked by confederations. And
Yeah.
so they have incentive, despite the fact that they might be happier by themselves, according to some state of nature stories. Right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether there is analogous worry about different societies. Societies that are governed by the kind of consumption-oriented ideology may have certain kinds of advantages when it comes to competing with other ones that might be more virtuous by your life.
Yes.
Yeah, so those are the two questions.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, let me try to take the two, and they're both extremely large questions, and I won't be able to say give an adequate answer. One feature of the natural environment in which humans evolved, and our ancestors evolved, and the animals who were ancestors of them evolved, was that it was generally an environment of scarcity. And an environment like that encourages a certain kind of opportunism, which is if you have an easy opportunity to get some reward, you should take it. You can't be sure when the next reward is going to be. In many of these cases, you can't store rewards. You can't just save them up. So the idea of thinking, well, I need to plan for my future, so I better not take advantage of this opportunity right now. You would not be able to plan for your future in most of those settings. And so the thought is that it's an opportunistic system which was designed for conditions of scarcity and taking advantage of rewards when we could. And that's the same thing that's happened with food. It's an opportunistic system that's designed to take advantage of calories and fat when it's available, because those are extremely hard to get in the natural environment. So if you create an environment in which calories and fat are easily obtained, then that's going to draw people in, even though it's making them not happy or healthy. Okay, so the answer is it's not really a failing from the evolutionary standpoint, but it is a failing if you've got a society of reasonable sufficiency. And it means we have to think, if we're at a reasonable level of sufficiency, we have to think in a different way about the allocation of our time and our effort and our diet. Yeah, okay. The second question is relative advantages of different styles. And part of what's interesting about this literature is I kind of went into it thinking, well, you know, there are societies that grow rapidly and they get the advantages of that, and societies that don't grow so rapidly, they do all this sort of community-based thing, but they don't grow as rapidly. And what's partly surprising is the societies that grow rapidly in recent decades have done that in a way that's actually reducing well-being for most of the population. Because it's taking the gains and it's concentrating them all. And as a result, instead of thinking, well, you'd at least be on the ship that was floating higher, you can't console yourself with that thought because you're not going to be on that ship. You're going to be on the little boat that they put alongside of the ship. And so in general then, the growth pattern, the pattern of the trajectory of growth, unless it's accompanied by other kinds of social changes and institutions, is not going to lead naturally to another way of getting high subjective well-being. And it can actually create conditions that make it harder to achieve that.
If I could just follow
Sure.
up. I'm not worried that some societies may be able to achieve higher level of subjective well-being by doing the things that you're recommending. But even if that were the case, some societies who are not as careful about their subjective well-being might be able to compete better in terms of their purchasing power, their ability to organize violence against others.
Oh, yes. Right.
So that's the kind of Hobbesian worry that one might have.
Right. Yes. Yeah. No, there's definitely a Hobbesian worry there. On the other hand, societies that are highly unequal in terms of this Hobbesian calculus, they're not all that great at fighting wars either, because they aren't great at commanding the allegiance of and committed motivation of their troops. And so, as we've seen recently, a country can be a powerful power because it's got all this armament and all this stuff, but if the population has basically been alienated, it's very hard for them to fight at the level that they should be able to fight. And the US discovered that as well. In World War II, much more equal society, much more committed soldiers. In subsequent engagements, it's been much harder. It's essentially a paid army now. And so in the Hobbesian calculus, I'm not sure which side I'd want to bet on. And I am really talking about happiness now. I'm not talking about muscle power. But social muscle is a hard thing to exercise. Because you remember the picture in Leviathan, on the original cover of Leviathan, the frontispiece, it shows a ruler with a sword and a staff. And if you look closely, it looks like a chainmail suit that he's wearing, but it's actually just a lot of little people. And the sword of the ruler is a lot of little people. And if the lot of little people are not prepared to wield the sword in the situations of extreme peril, then the power is not there.
Nick, is that a follow-up? Oh, no. Nikki?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, thanks again, Peter. So it seems like this convenient truth of yours is like, well, we in richer countries can actually have better lives consistent with reducing our consumption because of all these like non-consumption things that seem to be very important for well-being. That's all very persuasive and nice. And then the reason it's so convenient is that we need to reduce our consumption in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, but I worry that the way the global economy now works is that if people in richer countries reduce their consumption, that's actually really bad for people in poorer countries. So when there's a recession in the global people in the global south starve as a result, right? Because a lot of those economies are based on exporting
Right.
to the global north.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, as you pointed out last time, those countries also stand to suffer from climate change.
Yes.
But I worry that they would suffer from
Right.
from lower consumption growth
Yeah.
in rich countries.
Good.
As well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the idea that what we should do is just suddenly stop consuming would throw the economy of the world into a terrible tailspin and dislocate millions of workers all around the world. On the other hand, there is a movement for better pay for people in poorer countries, for better working conditions, for more equitable trade, for supporting trade that is less exploitative of human and natural environment. And that could be at a high volume, sufficient to support people's well-being. What we have right now is a system that's very destructive, and it has a high volume. But we could have a system that has a high volume and therefore makes possible a lot of trade, but which had a different design in terms of the nature of the work or the quality of the resources that were being used. And that's to some extent happening with these renegotiations. So it's a very important question, and it's very important that we take responsibility for doing this seriously. But it would mean, what it would mean to keep the volume the same, so to speak, is that various goods would cost more for us. We'd have to be willing to pay more for them, for clothing, for food, for electronics. Would that be, in itself, a loss of subjective well-being? Well, maybe locally for a little while. But it's hard for me to convince myself that back when we were wearing clothing for 5 or 10 years, rather than wearing it 7 times and throwing it away, that we were less happy with our clothing. I suspect we're probably not as happy now with our clothing as we were then. And so we've got a very fast cycle in the system, and it's an extremely rapacious and destructive cycle. But if we were paying decent wages and getting clothing that was durable and using clothing for a long time and not wrapping it all in the plastic that's sitting out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean right now, that would not be to the detriment of the economies of the countries that were now able to produce these things with more investment in the individual item and therefore with less exploitative labor and environmental conditions. But what we'd have to do is pay more for these things. Yeah, yeah. And you can do that right now. You can go down to Whole Foods and pay more for things that are produced equitably.
So, next is you. I don't have your name.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of small questions. So one is about correlation causation and some of the data that you've shown. So for example, if we look at teenagers, they are saying that they're less happy than before. So it could be that it's because they're using their phones more, but maybe it could be because there's less of a stigma, so they feel a little more free to actually be able to say that. So I wonder about some of the data that make those connections. If you can say a bit more about that in the correlation causation element. And the other one is about the snowblower example that you gave. Maybe we can share that. So a lot of the graphs that you presented were kind of showing a connection between some form of happiness and some form of pay or price or income of that sort. But I think that when you think about the snowblower example, you can also see that there must be some kind of connection between happiness and the relationships and their quality.
Right.
And if you are in a small neighborhood and everybody's really thoughtful about using the snowblower and you can actually use it, that's great. But if you have one snowblower and either the community is full of terrible, terrible people and nobody likes each other, or that it's impossible to share, then I'm sure that happiness will go down. So I'm wondering if there are any kind of graphs that represent that instead of happiness in relation to income as well.
Yeah, Great. Good questions and good examples. I knew the snowblower example would be a problem. Pulling things out of your fingertips is sometimes a risky activity. Okay, so about the first question, there is obviously some lessened stigma with saying, for example, that you're depressed or that you're anxious. And so, yes, we would get higher reporting rates for those. That's been true for a while now. And what's striking is we are still getting extremely high rates of anxiety and dysfunctionality. Students who are incapable of continuing their studies. And so if you look at the mental health statistics, it's not just what people are saying about themselves. It's the physical conditions they're showing up with, the difficulties they're having managing to balance the activities that are required in their lives, the extent of their social relations and connectedness. These all show problematic signs. And so, yeah, you always have to worry about these reporting issues. And one thing is to look for people who have been professionals in the area for a long time and who've been interacting with students as confidential counselors for a long time, and ask whether their view is that the students are just reporting more or whether they're actually seeing a different kind of student population. My experience has been talking with such people. I'm on a committee that deals with these issues, is that the people who've been at this for 30 or 40 years are the ones who are the most worried because of what they see in their practice. About the snowblower, you're quite right. I think it's part of, you ask, correlation is certainly not causation. People who live in communities with high levels of trust show higher subjective well-being. Well, that could be for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's because trust is something that's a contributor to subjective well-being. Sometimes it's because then you could rely upon people to return the snowblower when you lend it to them. And so you could think, yeah, there are going to be a lot of these factors which are both coming and going. There's like a mutual exchange. And trust is going to be one of them because trust makes possible all these other kinds of social relations and interactions. So yes, if you're in a community where people could not be trusted, then the snowblower solution would be not a solution you could adopt until people trusted each other more. On the other hand, if you're in a community that 30 years ago was full of relatively trusting neighbors who knew each other and now is not, you might ask whether a causative effect there is that people have organized their lives in such a way that they don't actually interact with their neighbors. And so they really don't have any idea of how trustworthy their neighbors are. And as a result, they aren't able to adopt certain kinds of solutions that would be useful. And so you could think we are in a situation where there are lots of things that you could inject into the system that would improve some aspects of its functioning with regard to subjective well-being. And again, these are all things that there is good evidence for. Social connectedness, social affiliation matters to people. Being charitable, giving generously to charities, this turns out to be a positive experience for people. Physical activity is very important, developing skills, contact with nature. So these are all things that we could do a little bit with and increase subjective well-being. And I suspect there'd be some synergistic effects. But each one of them is going to have the feature that success in it is going to depend to some extent on success in the others.
Actually, we decided to go to the full hour, so a bit longer than originally announced, but no longer than that. That gives us another 10 minutes, and I have 5 more questions.
Good. Well, thank you.
It's nothing. So, George.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for this. I was hoping you could say some things about an objection against using the idea of subjective well-being.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a threshold objection.
A kind of
threshold.
Yeah.
Objection to not to its rigor or to its importance qua notion of well-being, but to its relevance to questions of justice.
Mm-hmm.
By which I mean question about who does what about climate change or any other problem of justice.
Right.
And the objection I have in mind is objection from choice and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we leave aside things that have no direct connection to subjective well-being,
Mm-hmm.
even on the story you told about evolution,
Mm-hmm.
people will make different choices about how they derive that well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have someone who's unemployed
Mm-hmm.
because she looks down on other jobs.
Yeah.
And for that person only,
Mm-hmm.
but they cannot job will do.
Mm-hmm.
And then they end up unemployed
Mm-hmm.
because of their ambition.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
and you have someone who's unemployed because of racism or discrimination.
Yeah.
And clearly different justice considerations will apply to both to those things.
Yeah.
So the same could be for relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing if someone has low subjective well-being because they chose a certain vision of what it means to be in a good relationship. Some people think this is through friends, others through families or having kids. There are people who want to have 5 to 6 kids, and then there'll be a question about that choice. So
Yeah.
So for any pursuit of subjective well-being, there will be cost implications, and the question will be who bears the load of that. So then we get into the question of responsibility and choice. How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
And that to me seems crucial in the question of the climate.
Mm-hmm.
But none of that seems to me can be addressed by using the notion of well-being alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you is how far can we go
Mm-hmm.
if the questions are a question of distribution and a question of fair allocation of burdens?
Yeah.
If all we have is the notion of subjective well-being, which people will pursue differently, and that will have different cost implications for others.
Right. Good. Great. Yes. Questions of justice are obviously extremely central, and this is not a direct measure of justice or injustice. And so one way to think about it is this is a story not about how it is that we're going to remedy the various particular justices or injustices of human relations, but if there is a massive injustice of human relations, which is the injustices being done right now with regard to the environment and the exposure of the less developed countries to extreme environmental risk by the developmental excesses of the more prosperous countries, that's a huge injustice. And I think subjective utility or subjective well-being is very relevant to that one, because we're talking at the population level and we're asking the question is it possible for there to be a population which has a more just relation with the rest of the world in the developed world, but that has a comparable or higher level of subjective well-being? And that's a global level. It's not about individual relationships. And so it would seem to me that if you could say yes to that, that would be very relevant to this huge problem of injustice. Because you don't have to say that in order for people in the developed world to accept their responsibilities and engage in serious climate control, they have to sacrifice the possible quality of their lives in a way that can't be remedied. So that's not directly about justice, it's about subjective well-being, but the claim is it shows that there can be room for justice and distributive considerations in a similar way within a country. You could say, well, some people are rich because they work hard, some people are rich because they inherit, some people are poor because they don't want to work and they're particularly happy doing that. Yeah, that's all true, but there also is this massive injustice that exists in our distribution of income and resources in our societies. And the question is that something that's necessary to sustain the level of quality of life in this society? And again, the answer to that question seems to be no. That degree of injustice within the society does not seem to be such as to be necessary for the bulk of the people to have a reasonable level of well-being. And so that's another way in which there's a big relevance to questions of justice through this discussion of well-being. So that's all a connection with justice, but it's not a connection that answers the specific question, well, why should the person who's unemployed because they don't like work or they look down on work, why would they have a claim on resources that was the same as the person who's unemployed because of discrimination? And the answer to that question is, well, that's not just a question about happiness. That is a question about various kinds of standards of justice. So I'm certainly not trying to say you can answer all the questions of justice through discussing subjective well-being. The question is, are there issues of justice which the discussion of subjective well-being could help us get a handle on and make more tractable? And are those large injustices, are they serious injustices that we ought to do something about? And I think the answer is yes.
Hi, thank you. So sort of furthering the objection raised earlier over here, which was about the fact that your account, I think, risks being somewhat over-dependent on this correlation between consumerism and GDP growth with environmental damage.
Yeah.
Which is certainly historically true, don't get me wrong, but I think a lot of business people and politicians, leaders in especially the global north, are looking to have this decoupling of environmental harm and consumerism through
Are looking at what, sorry?
decoupling
Yeah.
of environmental harm and consumerism with technological advances. So I fear that those people might respond to your account by saying we don't need this very sophisticated look at eudaimonia and non-consumptive quality of life analysis, because we can just have the same zombie consumerism, but we can just have like an eco version of it. And I wonder how you might respond to that criticism.
So you think of some technological way?
Yeah, so we can just have the same old
We could have cleaner,
capitalism, but just clean capitalism.
yeah, and all the junk would evaporate when we stopped using it and so on. Yeah, and yeah, that's an interesting idea, and I guess the question that I would have is, if you actually look at people who are in the technology sector right now, they're very concerned with the question of how certain types of technology shape people's well-being. It's a big topic of discussion. And if what's happening is that the kinds of activities that are experienced as more positive experiences, like these kinds of activities, if they're being supplanted by electronic simulacra, then it could be that you're actually giving people the same capacity to spend their time. They're causing less pollution as a result of it, but they're still not getting the kind of well-being that they could if they were not displaced from activity into consumption. And so this kind of a worry, the worry that consumption displaces people away from activities that they do find intrinsically more rewarding, that is not just a problem about waste or the utilization of resources, and it's not a problem you would solve if you manage technologically to make it non-wasteful to replace activity with consumption. So I know people in the technology industry who are very interested in this question because they hope to find ways in which technology could actually provide experiences more like this than experiences like standard consumption experiences. So it's a good question.
Okay, last question from Ishka.
Thank you, Peter. I just have a question relating to I was very intrigued by the front-end effect you were talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it certainly does seem very convenient that a lot of the activities that are just not very satisfying to us are also activities that, if we reduce them, would also reduce environmental impacts.
Yeah.
But how do we overcome the front-end effect of persuading people away from doing things like scrolling on their phones, social media, all of that, to actually taking part in these more nurturing activities without instituting very draconian policies to limit screen time, for example, as a very superficial first pass?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, I was at a symposium on issues of ethics and technology, and a person in the field was saying, well, we're right now experimenting with the idea of having a counter on your phone which tells you, you've now spent 35 minutes surfing the web, or you've now spent 40 minutes surfing the web. And they're thinking, well, maybe we could ally that with, like a Fitbit, which would be monitoring various physiological signs. And they could say, and by the way, your internal measure of interest and engagement and mental activity has declined from 45 down to 32. And so you're saying, one thing you could say is, well, you can't tell people to stop doing things like this. That's not something you can do that works. Parents will tell you that. But the technology is not a given. The technology could be changed in a way that it was both easy of entry and more engaging, more productive with activities like this. That's something that you could, it's a design problem. And I would have no problem with people spending time on their phones if what they were doing was promoting their development, developing their skills, engaging in activities, working together. These are all things you could do on your phone. I don't see that there's an objection to saying that's what we should be thinking of. And so rather than just bemoaning the fact that people spend a lot of time in these ease of entry activities, how could we make the kinds of things that people find most meaningful easier to enter? And this is like a version of the question, how could you find a way of making taking care of your children easier for you? Or making taking care of your older parents easier for people? How could you make it easier for people to get access to education? How could you make it easier for people to get access to health care? Yes, you could increase the ease of entry into these goods, and then the goods themselves would deliver the rewards. So yeah, I don't think I could wag my finger at people and expect any good result to come of that. But I do think that what the literature on subjective well-being suggests is we've got a designed environment which is such that it is not eliciting this activity as fully as it could.
Okay, apologies to those who had questions. Bear in mind that you can maybe ask them tomorrow on Friday, but now let's thank Peter for really exciting.
Thank you.